Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who lovest mankind with the pure light of thy divine knowledge. May open the eyes of our mind to the understanding of thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things as are well pleasing unto thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God. And unto thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father, who is from everlasting, and thine all holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen.
Much better to be on this side of the camera.
That's right. Why not? You look better. Don't sit over here.
It's better with a golf hat,
Right with your golf hat off, looking good, Rick.
well, that's Bible.
I usually haven't combed my hair yet. That's why I do it.
Yeah.
Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. Winding down this year's subject, Jesus Christ, his life and teaching. And today we are going to talk about Jesus and his opponents. We've talked about Jesus and his disciples for the last few weeks. And now in the last few sessions, we're going to talk about how Jesus handled those who opposed him. So the conflict between Jesus and his opponents really runs through all four Gospels. Arose shortly after Jesus went out to preach. It has only grew stronger over the course of time.
What's that word?
Leitmotif. It's just sort of a theme that runs through all Gospels.
I've gotten that wrong on the SAT test.
Here's another word, the denouement of the conflict, or the climax of the conflict, came with the plot of the chief priests and the elders against Jesus, his trial and the pronouncement of his death sentence. In this icon here, we see the high priest renting his garments when Jesus said that he was.
You've been talking with Zimmerman?
Pardon?
You've been talking with Glenn Zimmerman?
No, I haven't.
Okay, grabbing a couple of those big words there.
What can I say?
Language.
Yeah,
When physicians get together and talk, it's
I know.
very high
Speak in
level.
French.
That's right.
We love to do that.
So who in fact did oppose Jesus? Well, we have several groups. The first ones we're going to talk about are the chief priests. So this term is encountered in the Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles 46 times in the plural, and usually it's paired with other categories. It's usually the chief priests and the scribes, chief priests and the Pharisees, the chief priests and the elders. So the chief priests, obviously their main responsibility was the temple worship. The chief priest would be analogous to our metropolitan or archbishop. And so there was only one chief priest at a time, and it was a hereditary position.
Why is it S plural?
Well, that's a good point. Let me back up. The high priest was the metropolitan. The chief priests would be the other bishops. And then the other priests would be what we would consider the presbyters or priests in the Christian sense. So although the incumbent high priest at the time of Jesus' public ministry was Caiaphas, as we know, his predecessor, named Annas, was actually his own father-in-law, was also still alive and actively participated in legal proceedings. And so in this icon, we see this is Jesus being brought before the high priest for his trial. And I believe this is Caiaphas and this is Annas sitting in judgment. So those were the high priests. And then, of course, there were the regular priests and Levites. And they're mentioned in the Gospels as two separate categories. There were priests and Levites. While the number of persons that be considered chief priests did not exceed a few dozen at any one time, the number of priests and Levites was in the thousands. So you can imagine, because why? Because they were constantly bringing, people bringing sacrifices to the temple for ritual sacrifice. And so they needed a lot of priests to perform the sacrificial rites. You had Levites who then would clean the altars and things like that. So literally thousands of priests and Levites to take care of that on a daily basis.
And only those priests, those which came from the tribe of Levi, only they could eat the sacrifices.
That's a
Right.
good point, Susie. I'm glad you brought that up. The tribe of Levi, if you remember in the Old Testament, was not given a plot of land like the other 12 tribes, or the other 11. They were given the priesthood, and so for their livelihood, literally they ate some of what the people brought for
That was
sacrifice.
the whole burnt offering and the burnt offering.
Correct. So a burnt offering was only partially burnt, and then the priests would partake of that. A whole burnt offering was the sacrifice was completely burnt, almost to ash, and there was nothing left to eat.
Like the bishop's steak. He likes it.
Well
Well
done.
done. Bishop Anthony.
Yeah.
Very
So
well done.
his would have been a burnt
Burnt
offering.
offering.
Burnt well on both sides. So those were called Levites in Jesus' time, were the lesser servers in the temple, including readers, singers, musicians, acolytes, cleaners, and guards.
So the scribes they're walking around taking notes. Is that what they're doing?
It would seem that way, but actually not. And I'll get to them in a moment,
Okay.
because it's a misnomer if we think of them as just writing things down. In Israel, not only the priesthood itself, but the rank of priesthood was also hereditary. All who came from that was from the tribe of Levi. Now, while the high priest descended from Aaron, okay, and that's why I said the high priest is a very narrow hereditary line. The other leading priests or chief priests descended from a priest called Zadok, who was the high priest during the reigns of David and Solomon. And so we have the line of Aaron. Now, if you look in our dome, Aaron is up there. This is right next to Moses. And he's holding in his hand the pot that contained the manna from heaven. And what we see here, it may be hard to see, but if you see it on the dome, there's a portrait of the Theotokos on his vessel, because she is the true vessel that held the manna from heaven. And so when Aaron is portrayed in our iconography, he is always portrayed carrying this vessel.
But
Now,
chronologically, obviously, that's not correct, right?
Yes, correct. This was, hundreds of years before Christ,
Right.
but the manna from heaven was a type of Theotokos. Sometimes he'll also hold the staff that budded, Aaron's staff budded, showing that from an inanimate object, life came through, and that was another type of Christ.
So the high priest didn't have the clue. I mean, they weren't right. Or were they right? Like Aaron must have been a high priest, right?
He was the first high priest.
So I mean, I can see he's honored by the Orthodox Church, but a lot of the other high priests, not so much.
Not so much. I don't think any of them, and I don't know the Old Testament well enough to know if any of them were singled out as particularly righteous men. And again, their position was not so much, they're not doing the sacrifices, as they're overseeing all of the other priests in the temple worship.
And he's on the dome, you said?
He's on the dome.
So he's a prophet?
He's a prophet. He's a prophet priest.
As well. Okay.
Correct. Same thing with Samuel. He's a prophet priest. And they're prophet kings like David and Solomon, and they're on the dome as well. And one final thing, the high priest is often vested very similar to our bishops. Okay, so that's, so that's correspondence between the Old Testament and New Testament clergy.
I think Kathy Abraham used to have a hat like that.
Like
Over
that.
there on the right.
That's pretty distinctive. Other priests and Levites descended from humbler members of the tribe of Levi and consequently could not aspire to higher positions in the hierarchy than those occupied by their own fathers. So if your father was a regular priest, you were a regular priest. If your father was a Levite, that's where you were. You couldn't become a chief priest or a high priest by advancing in any other way.
So do we, because of the descendancy of their priests, we say that our priests are in the order of Melchizedek, who is the Christ, right? Or
He's a type of
type
Christ.
of Christ. So our descendancy doesn't come from human beings, rather a spiritual priest.
That's right. And that's a good distinction, Rick. Because Melchizedek was not of the line of Aaron, and yet he was considered a priest and was actually given offerings by Abraham. He's considered a higher level apart from any human descent. So yes, all of our priests now are on the order of after Melchizedek because that's Christ. And our priests and bishops are all ordained by the apostles with that same apostolic succession. Next up are the elders and our rulers. These terms are interchangeable as well. This is a term, as a rule, refers to members of the Jewish elite who were influential in society, and they were not necessarily clergy. To this group belonged Nicodemus, who is referred to as a ruler of the Jews, who came to Jesus by night, as well as Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, whose daughter Jesus raised from the dead. Now, these two rulers did not oppose Jesus, obviously. In fact, they were very much probably his disciples at some point. But again, they belonged to a group that was called elders and rulers.
Did they do it silently though? You said they came at nighttime?
Nicodemus did. He came at night and talked to Jesus, but he didn't want it known that he was a disciple. So rulers could be either priests or laymen, could be part of the Sanhedrin or the ruling council, and could belong to the party of the Pharisees. And we'll see how this plays out later when we talk about the Pharisees. They were not clergy at all, but they were a very strong political party in the end.
Isn't St. Paul?
Pharisee,
Okay.
yes.
Sanhedrin a part, an area of land, or is that
It's
people?
it's people, it's a council.
I
The,
gotta get an org chart here, figure out what's land and what's people.
yeah, always Sanhedrin is the ruling council of people. Can be both clergy, that would be on, the chief priest would be part of it, the elders, scribes and Pharisees, they would all be on the ruling council. Sort of like the parish council, the highest level of parish council, maybe like the archdiocese, council board. There you
They
go.
were the ones calling for Christ's crucifixion.
Yes,
The
yeah,
Sanhedrin.
well, that's where the trial
Was held.
occurred, and that's where he was condemned by that group. Now, there was a hostile ruler that we hear about in the Gospel of Luke. And the story is this: Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity for 18 years, and she was bent over and could not in any ways raise herself up. I mean, she literally was locked in a forward bending position.
Is that the one that we talk about in the Episcopal Gospel around St. Nicholas Day in December?
It might be. I'm not sure when we commemorate her, but yes, we read this gospel in the church calendar. When Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said to her, "Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity." He laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue, and that's him on the right here, this guy putting his hand out, that means he's talking. But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. And he said to the crowd, there are 6 days on which men ought to work. Therefore, come and be healed on them and not on the Sabbath day. Now, understand that working on the Sabbath was a very fluid concept, and it was depending on who decided to interpret it. So healing a woman on the Sabbath was work, and that was verboten according to Pharisaic law. And so this ruler is indignant. Now, why was he indignant? Probably because Jesus was stealing his thunder. Jesus was there, performed a miracle that no one could believe. I'm sure a lot of the people knew this woman, knew that for 18 years she was bent over, and here she is miraculously healed in a moment. And so the ruler is a little bit upset about this. And Jesus comes right back at him. He says, hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall, lead it away and water it? Should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, think of it, for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath? Well, the ruler is just left speechless. I mean, how can he come back with that? And when Jesus had said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him.
No, he's more upset because he was put to shame.
He is. And
Admonished in front of people.
instead of taking that and repenting,
Yeah.
he probably joined the group that decided to kill Jesus later. This episode probably happened about midway through Jesus's ministry, so it wasn't exactly the beginning or the end, but somewhere along the line. But it gives you an indication of how Jesus handled those who opposed him and what happened when he answered them back. First of all, he was put to shame, and the multitude rejoices because of the glorious things that Jesus did. So even though the leaders were upset and took umbrage with what Jesus did, the people saw it for what it was and they believed. And this is what some of the things that brought them to believe in Christ.
So this could have happened a year or two before his crucifixion, so this guy's pot was boiling for a long time.
Yes, I imagine.
Is he saying Satan like bound this gal specifically, or is he linking like all illness and like physical malady to?
I don't think he's linking all physical maladies to satanic intervention. But I think at that time, when someone had a chronic, profound, overt illness or deformity like this, it was considered to be something that Satan had done to the person. When they talk about demonic possession, they'd say, this demon has possessed my child for whatever time. So not all illnesses were, but I think in this case, Jesus is kind of hinting that might be what was here situation.
No, he wasn't necessarily turning the other cheek when people admonished Christ. I mean, he didn't come back at them with vim and vigor, but he did, give it right back to them.
He did, because when it was necessary. What was he doing with this ruler? He was showing him the hypocrisy of his action. Because he said to him, look, you talk about work, you loose the livestock to go feed them and water them on the Sabbath. So don't tell me if I'm healing this woman that's breaking the Sabbath. So when he came back at them, he actually came back at them for their own good.
Right.
He gave them an answer, but it was also a lesson. Next group is what we would call the Herodians. They're mentioned in the Gospels 3 times, usually paired with the Pharisees or with the disciples of the Pharisees. Now, in all likelihood, this term refers to persons serving in the court of King Herod Antipas. And St. John of Damascus says that they actually looked for Christ in Herod, and in Herod they imputed the dignity in the name of Christ. So this group of followers of Herod Antipas actually considered him to be the Messiah or the Christ. Not many people believed it. It was pretty much just a cult of Herod Antipas. But they were somewhat powerful, especially in Galilee, where Herod Antipas was the ruler. And now the scribes and the lawyers. And these played an important role in the life of the people of Israel. Scribes were copyists, so yes, they did copy the scriptures and make copies of them. But more than that, they were keepers of the books, and they were experts in the law, to whom people would turn for clarification in matters of controversy. And so they were considered lawyers, and those terms are interchangeable in the gospel. So when you hear a scribe or a lawyer, that's pretty much the same thing. And the law was not civil law like we would consider now, it was the law of Moses. And so all of those Mosaic laws, and I think there were like 630 of them. And so those Mosaic laws, the scribes knew them front and back. They knew every aspect of the laws of Moses, and they were the ones that people would turn to when they had a question.
So
about
those laws were made by Moses, they weren't like derivatives of Moses's law?
And that's where we come into problems, Rick. There were derivatives of Moses's law by these scholars and the Talmudic scholars who expanded on the Mosaic law. And this is where Jesus, and we'll talk about here in a minute, he talks about the traditions of men. And that's where those people added to the Mosaic law things that were not ever written in the Torah. And so that, and some of these lawyers would actually invoke those laws, the unwritten laws, the oral laws. But mostly the Pharisees did. Mostly the Pharisees were keepers of the oral tradition.
But often, when Jesus was calling them out,
Mhm.
he would say scribes and Pharisees.
Yes,
It seems like a lot of times he included the scribes.
that's right, because the scribes I think the Pharisees brought the scribes along as sort of a backup. Okay, I may not know the law as well, but this scribe with me is going to know the law. And so now we're going to go after him with all the force of the law. So yeah, the Pharisees would have reinforcements through the scribes and the lawyers. So again, the term lawyer is often used as a synonym for the term scribe.
I had no idea that the Pharisees weren't religious leaders. I thought of them as that.
No, it's interesting. They are lay people who had a lot of influence on the multitude. We have one instance where a scribe does come and he tests Jesus. And one of the scribes came and he had heard the Sadducees reasoning together and perceiving that Jesus had answered them well. The Sadducees came to Jesus and they brought this hypothetical situation. A man has a wife, they don't have any children, he dies, and then there are 7 brothers. Each brother comes and they have no children, et cetera, et cetera. In the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? And of course, Jesus confounds them and they are left speechless. The scribe hears the situation, so he comes and he decides he's going to come and test Jesus himself. And then he says to Jesus, well, which is the first commandment of all? And Jesus said to him, the first commandment is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Interestingly, until I read this, I didn't realize that the Old Testament had both of these commandments in them. So love your neighbor as yourself was a Mosaic law. And this is one of the things that I think the Jews at that time maybe did not understand that or follow that as well. they certainly loved the Lord their God when they were with him, when they weren't apostatizing. But the other one, I was surprised that that was part of their laws.
Which ties into when the apostles asked Jesus how many times you have to forgive somebody. 7 times? I thought that was a lot.
Yes, Peter asked him that.
Yeah.
And the reason he said 7, by the way, because the Old Testament said 3 times.
Oh,
If you forgive your brother 3 times, after that,
you're good.
you're done. Peter, wanting to justify himself, said, I'm going to do better than that. I'm going to say 7. And Jesus said, well, how about 70 times 7, which is infinite number. And so, yes, there was forgiveness in the Old Testament as well. So the scribe said to Jesus, well said, teacher, you have spoken the truth, for there is one God and there is no other but he. And to love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, with all the soul, with all your strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. Now, this is the scribe saying this. And Jesus says to him, he saw that he had answered wisely. He said, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared question him. So notice how the scribe, when he comes to question Jesus and try to trick him, Jesus actually turns it around and says to the man, you're pretty wise. You're close to God. And the scribe was like, wait a second, this didn't go the way I expected here. So those are the scribes. And now we come to the Pharisees. And this term is thought to come from the Aramaic word pharisei, which means to be set apart, separate. Little is known of the Pharisees of Jesus' time. The New Testament gives us some information, and the Jewish historian Josephus provides information regarding the Pharisees. They lived a simple ascetic life and despised delicacies in diet. They basically follow a Lenten diet, essentially. Okay, and they live very simply. They're not extravagant. They follow the conduct of reason, and what that prescribes to them as good, for them they do it. So they follow reason, which I was interesting to note. They pay a respect to such as in years, basically the elders. Nor do they contradict them in anything which they have introduced. So they respect their elders and they follow what the elders before them have told them.
So instead of following the law,
Well, they do
they
follow.
conduct the reason.
Well, they use reason. What they do is they take the law and then they use their own reason to interpret it. And I think this is where they fell into trouble. And then they respect their elders, and what the elders taught, they keep.
So getting back to his org chart, are these guys on the top of the list or not?
They're not on the top of the list. I would say they're sort of infused into all of Jewish society at that time. In other words, they are laymen, but they influence political rulers, they influence the religious rulers.
The media.
Media or politicians.
I remember Subdeacon Nicholas
Or is that one
saying
and the same?
Pharisees, he would say, they're fair, you see, they're fair, you see. And he would say the Sadducees, they're sad. So were the Sadducees like going around like this?
No, in fact, the Sadducees were the big shots. They were the elite of society, even though they weren't all clergy and chief priests. They were sort of like the oligarchs of the society. They were wealthy and they had a lot of material influence.
Aren't the Pharisees always portrayed as like bigwigs in movies and things like that? Yet they led a simple life.
Right. They are portrayed, and because again, I think there were a lot of them, and they were very vocal.
Immediately.
Charlie, you said last year when we were studying Janine Constantina's book, that the Catholic Church followed a path of reason as opposed to the Orthodox Church, and that's where the divide or contributed to the divide. And now you're saying the Pharisees were were doing the same.
Yes, that's right. And I think that in the medieval times, the Roman Church went to a very scholastic type of theology that followed reason, and that's why they tried to prove by reason all of these things, prove the existence of God, prove the elements are changed into the body and blood of Christ. They had everything had to come down to a reasonable explanation, and they kind of followed that whole path. Now, look at this last thing. When they determine that all things are done by fate, this is the Pharisees. So not only do they go by reason, but they also consider fate to be the determining factor in many people in their lives. And of course, we as Christians don't believe that fate is our determining factor. We believe that God provides a pathway in our life. So they do not take away the freedom of men of acting as they think fit. In other words, fate says you're going to be doing this in your life, and you have the choice to either follow that or not. They don't take men's freedom away, but they also believe that fate has a big influence on people's lives. And by the way, St. John of Damascus said they also introduced the horoscope into Jewish teaching as well. Now, the Pharisees also believe that souls have an immortal rigor in them, that is, they live on after the death of the body, and that under the earth there are rewards or punishments according to how people lived, either virtuously or viciously in this life. Okay, so they believe in an afterlife. They believe that there's either reward or punishment, and that those who lived viciously are to be detained in an everlasting prison, but that those who lived virtuously shall have the power to revive and live again. Now, isn't that interesting? You would think that these people would be natural allies of Christ because he preached the resurrection as well. But yeah, that's what they believed. And on account of which doctrines they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people. So because of their beliefs, a lot of people were persuaded to believe the same things they did.
But was it incarnation they were believing or resurrection?
I think resurrection. When it says they have the power to revive and live again, I don't think it was reincarnation. I think it was the same soul, the same body that revived. Any questions or? So they really, how people worshiped, how they prayed, how they sacrificed, were given a lot of influence from the Pharisees. Now the Sadducees. This term derives from the Hebrew word Sadduqim, and the Aramaic Sadduqi. This term is possibly linked to the name of the high priest Zadok that we just talked about earlier. And they were from the Samaritan race, so they were not purely Jewish. Concerning the Sadducees, Josephus notes that according to their doctrines, souls die with the bodies. They don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And so that was one of the places where they differed from the Pharisees. According to St. John of Damascus, they acknowledge neither the angels nor the Holy Spirit. Their doctrine is received by only a few people, but those who did receive it had the highest dignity. In other words, the upper levels of society, the big shots. When they reluctantly became magistrates, and that sometimes they were forced to become magistrates, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees because the multitudes would not otherwise bear them. So in other words, if they became a magistrate, they would believe the same thing the Pharisees did, so that the multitudes wouldn't throw them out or worse. So those are the Sadducees, the Pharisees. That's all the groups that were opposed to Jesus. Now, the ability of the Pharisees and the Sadducees to collaborate with each other is confirmed by Josephus as well as the Gospels. We hear in the Gospels many times, particularly near the end of Christ's life, around this time of the year that we're celebrating, that the Pharisees and the Sadducees got together with the chief priests and the scribes to plot how they were going to get kill Jesus. So this is, even though they hated each other, these groups did not like each other. But their overriding concern was, we've got to get rid of this man.
So when do you think they start plotting? I mean, time frame,
Probably,
the minute you started preaching?
no, I don't think they started plotting then. Well, I take it back. Some of them wanted to get rid of him right at the beginning. But I didn't think they started coming together until probably after Lazarus was raised. And then Christ enters into Jerusalem, and now thousands of people are hailing him. Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Then they come together. How are we going to get rid of this man?
That's just like the week before his resurrection, or his
Yeah.
crucifixion, huh?
Right.
Wow,
Desperate times.
man, they got at it.
Yeah.
You said the Sadducees were Samaritans?
They're part of it. Some of them were Samaritans.
I mean, they weren't favorably looked upon, were they?
No.
Samaritans?
Not at all. They were really not enemies of the Jewish race, but they did not get along with them. The Pharisees were an organized party of members committed to a particular understanding. Where rulers could be influenced, Pharisees lobbied for their views. They were lobbying. Moreover, the Pharisees were sufficiently schooled in the ways of the world to participate in councils and coalitions with rivals when the situation required it and when their goals were established. In this respect, they functioned as a political interest group. And this is why the Pharisees had a lot of influence, because they knew how to work the system. Okay. It is thought that there were fewer Sadducees than Pharisees, but those who joined the Sadducees were the elite. And certain chief priests were Sadducees. In the contrast to the Pharisees, the Sadducees did not have much influence over the people. So what are some of the problems that the scribes and Pharisees had? In the beginning, it was just the scribes and Pharisees. The chief priests, elders, and Sadducees show up later, around this time that we're talking about, Holy Week. The scribes and Pharisees acted in tandem, and one can assume that many scribes belonged to the party of the Pharisees. So you see there's some overlap here going on. First question that came up, can one eat with publicans and sinners? That was a big question. When did this come up? This came up when Jesus called Levi or Matthew to follow him as a disciple. And he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax office. He said to him, "Follow me." He arose and followed him. Now what happens, Levi makes a big banquet at his home. And all the tax collector buddies of his and other sinners all come together and eat with Jesus. Jesus and his disciples are invited, and they were many of them, and they followed Jesus. Scribes and Pharisees saw that, and they said to his disciples, Jesus' disciples, "How is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners? How dare he?" And don't forget, the Pharisees were set apart. We don't eat with publicans. We don't eat with sinners. We don't even go in the same room with them. When Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." So notice he doesn't put down the Pharisees. He just basically tells them, you guys are well, you don't need a physician, but I came to treat those who are sick. And then Matthew adds this. He says to them, "But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice." And so again, when Jesus answers them, he teaches them. He doesn't necessarily condemn them, but he teaches them what they're doing wrong. And I think, to back up for a moment, we have to take this lesson for ourselves. When we want to condemn someone for what they're doing, we have to step back and look at ourselves and say, wait a second, am I being like the Pharisees and scribes by condemning someone else? I really need to look at myself and before I condemn someone else. So this is the first accusation. Why does he eat with publicans and sinners? Well, in the Old Testament, in reference to the Pharisees, they learned that holiness and purity were understood, first of all, as being separate from all that is unclean and holy. And there were a lot of rules in the Torah that told you what was clean and what was unclean. In Leviticus, they also learned that you shall be holy, for I am holy. This is God talking to his people through Moses. And the Lord says, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Well, they interpret it to mean, just as I am holy, so you are holy. Just as I am separate, so you be separate. So separate yourselves away from anything that is unclean. That's what the word Pharisee means, separate. The Pharisees were most afraid of being defiled by touching something unclean or associating with people whom they considered unclean. And Jesus, eating and drinking with tax collectors, publicans, and sinners, was breaking all the rules. And Jesus, as we read in the book here, subverted the people of Israel's longstanding notion of uncleanness that had come down from the time of Moses, and he did so consciously and consistently.
Was Matthew a Pharisee?
No,
He was a tax collector,
right.
but in the chosen, he would always write things down. Remember that?
That's just a character development. That
Okay.
is not.
I wondered if it has something to do with not, through touching something
Maybe.
unclean.
Maybe.
That's, yeah.
There's probably a good possibility that those who were not Pharisees still were influenced by some of their practices,
Mm.
and so felt that they had to ritually clean themselves as well. How did Jesus, he not only ate with tax collectors and sinners, he touched lepers, which was big no-no.
Right.
He touched dead bodies
Yeah.
when he raised little girl, arise again. And when he allowed the sinful woman at the house of Simon the Pharisee to come, she washed his feet with her tears, wiped them with her hair, and then anointed him. This was a big no-no. A sinful woman like this, don't you know who this is? And you're letting her come and, touch your feet. So he broke all those rules. But he did them out of mercy. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And so he taught by what he did. In the Old Testament, the source of uncleanness was something external to a person, and anything that somebody touched they were defiled. They became ritually unclean. Certain types of food were considered unclean, and there's a whole list of these in the book of Leviticus. If you're reading the Old
I haven't
Testament,
had the Leviticus.
you'll be amazed. Everything is unclean. So they would be considered defiled if they touched any of that. Jesus, on the contrary, insisted that the cause of uncleanness must be sought outside of a person, not inside. Sorry, not outside, but inside the person. I said that wrong. To the Pharisees, then Jesus said to them, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside of them will be clean also. So Jesus is basically telling them, you can clean the outside of yourselves, but inside you're still full of all of these hypocritical and very sinful emotions. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outside, but inside are full of dead man's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you appear outwardly righteous to men, but inside you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And this is why he called out the Pharisees, because you look like you're real righteous. Everybody thinks you're real righteous. You're influencing society this way, but in reality, inside you're full of envy, hate, greed, covetousness, all of these things. So can one eat with one washed hands? That's the other thing they had trouble with Jesus. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to Jesus. Having come from Jerusalem, they followed him everywhere he went. Now, when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. The Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat unless they washed their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. And this is what I'm talking about. These aren't things that were written in the Torah. This is the Pharisees decided we're going to have even more rules. And we're not talking about eating with filthy hands. They washed their hands, but the rules were you had to wash up to your elbows, both sides. You had to do it, almost like you're scrubbing for surgery. And this is what the ritual washing was. And this is what the disciples did not do before they ate. And this is what the Pharisees had trouble with. And so when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. There are many other things which they received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, vessels, and things like that. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked Jesus, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?
You ever think that many of our rituals today border on that? I mean, there's a lot of things we do that, who knows what the meaning is? We still got a loved one.
Yes.
But look at our, with the sacraments and the cleaning out of, the cup after, the priest consumes the communion,
Mhm.
washing the hands,
When the bishop
Yeah.
does that, yeah.
so some of that relates to some of this or not?
Have to understand when the priest or the deacon cleanse the vessel, the chalice,
Yeah,
and that is the body and blood of Christ
Yeah.
that has to be treated in a very separate, different way. And they have rubrics for that, the clergy do. I don't think that relates to what these Pharisees are saying.
I missed that, Rob. Did you mention when the bishop washes his hand? But the priest doesn't, right?
No,
It would just
no.
the bishop does
But
it,
they do clean out the cup.
right?
But I mean, and again, not to go off too far off the subject, but when, God forbid, the body and blood falls to the ground. I mean, I've seen our deacon come down and actually remove it from the floor by himself.
Well, we had carpet in the old church
cut the carpet out.
and we were told when that happened, you guys remember that we couldn't walk over there. Remember, we had to be steered away and then they came in and cut
Wow.
the carpet and replaced it. Remember?
Yeah. So again, because the reality of the Eucharist is such that it has to be treated in a totally, completely separate way.
Sure.
So he answers them, he says, Isaiah prophesied to you guys as hypocrites. You honor me with your lips, but your heart is far from me. And that's the bottom line. He was saying, you talk a good game, but you don't really believe me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men, the washing of cups, pitchers, all those things. And it says, all too well, you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your own tradition. And I'm going to go through this. He just basically tells them, you've got your traditions here and you're breaking the law of Moses. The washing of hands, it's not hygienic requirement in the first place. It's, like we said, just staying away from what they considered unclean. And there's a whole list of these things in the book of Leviticus. If you're interested, it's in there. The tradition of the elders, a multitude of other things were added to the law of Moses, as we said. And then the thing is, the Pharisees found loopholes that they could avoid doing the Mosaic law. So while they're criticizing all these disciples for not following these traditions, they found loopholes to get away from it. And
That tradition is not ended. Right?
There's a story of W.C. Fields. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of W.C. Fields, a movie star, comedian. So he and Gary Cooper were very good friends, but they were both atheists. Okay, and W.C. was in the hospital dying. So Cooper comes to see him, and he walks in the room, and W.C. has got this huge Bible in his lap. And Gary Cooper goes, Bill, what are you doing? He said, looking for loopholes.
Well, hopefully he found one.
Yeah.
Get in. So the bottom line here, and I'll finish up with this, there is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him. And that's what Jesus was trying to impress on the people. He moves from rebuking the Pharisees to instructing people, but even his disciples sometimes didn't understand it. When he had called the multitude to himself, he says, "Hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things that come out of him, out of his heart, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear." And when he entered the house away from the crowd, the disciples asked him concerning this parable. What do you mean by that? And he said to them, "Are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from the outside cannot defile him? Because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and thus is eliminated, thus purifying all foods. What comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, and foolishness." That's a quite comprehensive list there. And that's what he's trying to say. Those are the things that defile a person, and they originate inside the heart. Clean those up if you want to clean things. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. And again, he said, don't you understand that whatever goes in goes out to the sewer? What he's saying is that bodily functions are natural, they're normal. He's not disdaining the body. And in terms of uncleanness, it's not the condition of the body, the condition of the soul, which is the one where sin originates. It is sin that is uncleanness, not illness or infection. It is not the sewer that's spiritually unclean, but the soul of a person when it becomes like a sewer.
Is that like saying it's not the act, but it's how you react to what happens that defines a person?
Yes, yes, very good analogy, Nick, because something happens, how you react to it, can you forgive? Are you possessed by anger? All of these things, and those are those things that you can control, and you have control over them. You can't control maybe what happened to you, but you can control how you react to it. Matthew, real quickly, he adds another dialogue. Jesus, the disciples came to him and said, the Pharisees were offended when you talked about this.
By the way.
Yeah, we got to deal with these people.
Really?
Jesus says, every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Here he's cursing the fig tree and that. And then he says, leave them alone. Forget the Pharisees. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, they will both fall into a ditch. So Jesus said, they're offended. Sorry, guys. You're going to have to live with it because this is, they're blind. They don't know what they're saying.
And it's not that he didn't try to teach them.
Correct.
It's just they weren't listening.
They did not want to listen. And he who has ears to hear, they did not open their spiritual ears. So,
Bottom
yeah.
line of our Bible study, Matthew, we finished until the fall,
Mhm.
was that God's just not talking to the Pharisees alone.
Right.
He's talking to all of us, and are we hearing him?
And thank you, Susie. I think that's one thing we tend to forget. We tend to think that the Pharisees are these bad guys
In that time,
and they deserve all of this condemnation. But we have to always put ourselves in place of the Pharisees and say, am I being a Pharisee like that? The Pharisee and the publican, am I being the guy that says, I'm not like him who does all those bad things. I tithe 10% and I fast twice a week. Self-righteousness, pride, easy to get into. So Jesus was a revolutionary. In the context of the tradition of the Jews, Jesus was teaching revolutionary concepts. He didn't condemn the law, he just explained to them that the law is a guide for you, but don't take the law as the end of it. You go with what I'm teaching you. I'm expanding on the law. So that's it for today. No class next Sunday. We'll meet in 2 weeks, God willing.
Thank you.
All right.
Charlie.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you very much.
Happy Palm Sunday, everybody.
Better get to church fast, you'll be not getting received.
Yeah.
CE's coming.
We're on.
I don't think I saw.
That's right.
Good to see you, sir.
I know
That's right.
Sunday fast.